but we have the right to ask companies now what data they have on us. So this one woman wrote to Tinder, and she thought she'd get maybe 5 pages back. She got 800 pages back. And then she realized, like, they weren't just tracking who she was looking at on Tinder, they were tracking all her locations. They knew where she'd been on dates. She knew how long that she spent on that date. So the ability to actually see what data companies have on us, the right to delete that data, and also the right to demand that that data isn't sold on.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, live in Harvard Square, and thank you for joining us for what promises to be a timely and somewhat edgy discussion about trust. A small word, but one with huge ramifications in today's complex technological world. Who can you trust? It's the subject of tonight's forum and also the title of Rachel Botsman's latest book on the subject. I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum, and we're pleased to have Rachel as our guest speaker tonight on the last stop of her 9-week tour, which rather begs the question of why is trust such a hot topic around the world at this point in history? It is a time when confidence in institutions and governments is at an all-time low, but when there has been a huge surge in the growth of shared economy companies like Airbnb, Tinder, and Uber. Statistics show that we are shifting our trust away from institutions toward individuals, or some would say strangers, in areas as diverse as dating, banking, to sharing rides, or even hiring nannies. Botsman has been investigating these trends to try and understand how technology is transforming trust and exploring what the implications are for our decision-making in life, work, and business. Botsman completed her postgraduate studies at Harvard and lectures at Oxford. She divides her life between Sydney, where she lives with her husband and 2 children, and London. We welcome Rachel Botsman.
And I'm very excited to talk to you this evening about my work on trust. And what I thought we would explore is this trust shift that is happening from institutions to individuals. And I hope that I can give you a balanced view on the implications of this shift that are both good and bad, and that we are starting to feel in all different areas of our lives. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I will open it to all your questions. Before I get started, I just want to get a little bit of a feel for you. So if you could just raise your hand. Sorry, my clicker's not working. If you could raise your hand if you've ever been a guest on Airbnb. So that's almost all of you. Anyone a host on Airbnb? 2 people, because it actually requires more trust to be a host than a guest. Does anyone own Ethereum, the cryptocurrency Ethereum? Could you raise your hand? Raise your hand if you don't know what Ethereum is. Okay, all of you. Okay, so I'll talk about that a little bit. It's a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. Has anyone been on the dark web? And you don't have to tell me what you've bought, but just if you've been on there and seen it. Gentleman at the back, very gentleman at the back. Who doesn't know what the dark web is? Okay, well, this is where you can go and you can find all kinds of things like drugs and guns and pornography. I only go on there for research purposes, I promise. So. But all these things are examples of how technology is changing the way that we can trust one another. I thought that I would start with a personal story. It's a very important story to me because when you become obsessed with a topic enough that you dedicate your life to researching it and you want to write a book, there's a point where you start to ask yourself where this fascination has come from. And I realized that my fascination in how we trust people, how we place our faith, often in strangers, had started at this very, very young age. So what happened was, around the age of 5, my mum decided she was going to go back to work. And like many women, she needed some help, so she was going to hire a nanny. Now, for some reason, she placed an advert in this posh British magazine called The Lady. So if any of you are Downton Abbey fans, you'll know that The Lady is where people hire their gardeners and their butlers and their nannies. So anyway, this woman who answered was called Doris. And I remember the day Doris walked into our house because she had this really big curly hair, she had these steel-rimmed glasses, and a very, very thick Scottish accent. So every time she said my name, she would roll her R's. And the thing I remember so clearly was she was wearing a Salvation Army uniform, complete with the navy bonnet. Now, these things are very important when they come to trust. They are called trust signals. And trust signals are clues or symbols that we knowingly or unknowingly use to decide whether someone is trustworthy or not. You are probably tuning in to some of my signals right now. The problem is that some signals are louder than others, and sometimes we get influenced by the wrong things. Now, Doris lived with us for almost 10 months, and for the most part, she was a really good nanny, and there wasn't anything suspicious about her. Until one weekend, she disappeared, and by day 3, my parents are now worried about where Doris is. So they go around to our neighbor's house, and our neighbors are called the Luxembourgs, and my dad says, our nannies were friendly with one another, do you know where Doris is? And he says, that's so funny you've come round, because I've just found out that your nanny and our nanny are running one of the largest drugs rings in North London. It's a completely true story. Now, at this point, my parents are really worried that Doris is going to come home, so they search her room and they find all kinds of things that you really don't want laying around when you have young children. And then what happened was 3 days later, the police come knocking at the door and they arrest my dad. Because Doris wasn't a member of the Salvation Army going off on a Sunday for charity. She was robbing banks. And she had been involved in an armed bank robbery, and she'd used our silver family Volvo estate as a getaway car. Now, I love this story because I like to remind my parents that they left me in the care of a drug-dealing bank robber for almost 10 months, but it is really interesting when you think about it, because my parents say, oh, I believe it or not, they're rational people. They often make good decisions, have good judgment. And so I started to think of how did they make such a bad decision when it came to Doris? Why do we often place our faith in people who are untrustworthy? And the thing that I realized is that they thought they had enough information to make a decision about her. But in reality, they faced a trust gap. And this, I think, is so profound as to what's happening in society today. And that is that often in our lives, the illusion of information is actually far more dangerous than ignorance. So the way trust theorists will put this is a gentleman called Diego Gambetta. He'll say that trust has 2 enemies, not one. The first is bad character, and the second is poor information. So the question that I started to ask myself in my research was, how can a technology address these problems? Is technology making us smarter about who we trust, or is it encouraging us to place our trust in the wrong people and the wrong places? So are we, in fact, giving our trust away to the wrong things, and is technology playing a role in that? Now, why do I think this is such an important question? All right, so let's do a very quick exercise. You can kind of see where this is going. So I'm going to give you a boo. It's going to sound nice and loud in this church, right? And you can use that boo for the person you think is the least trustworthy. Okay, so when I say their name, you boo if you think you only get one boo, right? So if you think Harvey Weinstein is the least trustworthy person on this slide, say boo now. One boo. Okay, if you think President Trump is the least trustworthy person on this slide, say now. Okay, now, I don't know if you know who this is. This is Sophia the robot, and she is the first robot that has citizenship. She's been made a citizen of Saudi Arabia. Now, if you think Sophia is the least trustworthy person on this slide, say boo now. Okay, so the robot is more trustworthy than the President of the United States, but we don't need to worry about that right now. Okay, so let's do this in reverse. You can clap. So I'd like you to clap for the company you think is the most trustworthy. So if you think Google is the most trustworthy company on this slide, clap now. Okay, I describe that as tepid, but Facebook, who thinks Facebook is the most trustworthy company on this slide? No one. Okay, Amazon. So I think Amazon and Google were I don't know, maybe Amazon was slightly ahead, but it's actually a rubbish exercise. But I made you to do it because I thought that one of you might say to me, Rachel, trust them to do what? And this is a really important point, and it's something that I find very hard when I open up the newspapers or I listen to the media, is that the way we're talking about trust is in these very, very general terms. It's actually very dangerous because, we can trust that President Trump will tweet something ridiculous at 3 a.m., but we don't trust him to negotiate with North Korea. We can trust even that Harvey Weinstein could make great movies, but we don't trust his behavior necessarily around women. And Amazon is really interesting, right? So when people, I think when they say that they trust Amazon, they're saying that they have confidence that when they make an order online, those parcels will show up. They don't necessarily trust them to pay taxes or to treat their employees well. So this is the first thing that I would like you to think about, is when we're talking about trust, is to keep in mind that in our own lives, but also when we're talking about institutions and leaders and individuals, that trust is highly contextual. You can trust me, hopefully, to write an article or to teach students. Do not get in the car with me because I'm a terrible driver. So, now why did I show you this? I showed you this because if you look at the surveys, so Reuters, Gallup, Ipsos, Harvard are doing all these kinds of surveys, they're all telling the same sad story. And that story is very depressing and very worrying. So the narrative is that trust is in a state of crisis. And where this is coming from is that if you look at the surveys, trust in all major institutions, so not just government, but charities, religious organizations, big businesses, and the media, is at an all-time historic low. Now, I urge you to look at these surveys and really dig into their methodology, because one of the problems is the way they ask the question is just how we did that exercise. Do you trust the media? Do you mean, Reddit? Or do you mean the New York Times? What are you trusting the media to do? But that said, you can see an historic pattern. And what we have to look at is not the institutions with the lowest level of trust. So government trust has always been low. Is the institutions with the sharpest decline. And the institution actually with the sharpest decline is the media. In the West, it's around an average of 16 points within less than 12 months, which is very significant. And so there's all kinds of reasons as to why this is happening, and I'm going to explain a little bit why. Because an erosion of trust is basically a lack of faith. It's a lack of faith or confidence in the system. It's a feeling that the system is failing us. And one of the problems is when you look at how institutional trust works, so this idea that we place our faith, often blind faith, in a few elite leaders, and they get to operate behind closed doors and keep things hidden and keep things secret, that wasn't designed for the digital age. I mean, you see this coming out, like the Weinstein scandal and the movement it's created is a symptom of this, that institutions cannot protect people, no matter how powerful they are, when they break people's trust. But I don't think this narrative that trust is in crisis is helpful. I don't think it's healthy to society, because what it actually does is it amplifies people's fears. It amplifies people's anger, and it creates a vacuum. And I'm going to talk more about that. But the other reason why I don't like this narrative is because I don't think trust is in crisis. I think there's plenty of trust out there. It's just flowing in different directions and different people. And so this trust, the easiest way to think of it is like energy. You'll know that energy can't be destroyed. Energy is continually changing form. And so what's happening is trust, our trust that used to flow upwards, whether that be to leaders, to CEOs, to regulators, to experts, to academics, is being inverted. And it's now flowing sideways through networks, through systems, through marketplaces, through technologies, sometimes to complete strangers, sometimes to friends on the internet, sometimes to our colleagues, and sometimes to our peers. And so why is this so profound? Well, when you look back historically, and you look at the history of trust, and I promise you it's interesting when you actually go back and you look at how trust really is like the social glue of society. Trust is like liquid gold. Without trust, human beings, they can't trade, they can't collaborate, they can't cooperate, They can't be vulnerable with one another. So trust has always existed. But in its first chapter, very long period in history, trust was local. Really easy to understand. This is when we all lived in villages and communities, and trust was largely personal. So I would trust you because I knew you or someone knew you. And if you did something wrong, you would get a bad reputation. And that would impact your ability to transact or have relationships in the future. Now, what happened is when we went through mass migration, when we wanted to trade internationally, this type of trust didn't work. So as a society, we invented institutional trust. We invented things like corporate brands that would tell us what products and services that we should buy. We invented risk mechanisms like insurance. We invented lots of intermediaries, whether it was real estate brokers or lawyers. And so trust stopped flowing directly between people and started to flow through institutions. Now, I'm not saying these two forms of trust don't exist and shouldn't exist in society, but what's happening is there is a third form of trust rising up and challenging, particularly institutional trust. It's what I call distributed trust. And the irony is that this is a trust that flows directly between people again. It just is flowing at a scale that's never been possible before. And sometimes the other person is a real human being, and other times it's an artificially intelligent bot or an algorithm. So what I thought I'd now explore with you is some of the consequences of this shift, how distributed trust works, and how we see it enabling incredible things, but also how we're seeing it can be precarious, because too much trust in the wrong people isn't necessarily a good thing. So let's look at this in three different ways. Let's look at this through three different lenses. First of all, I want to look at our trust in new ideas. And new ideas, they really could be anything. They could be a new technology, but they could be a new political idea. They could be a new philosophy. So how do people build trust in new ideas? All right, so I'm not sure how this is going to work, but we'll try it. Okay, so actually, I think it's going to be difficult, but let's try it. Let's give it a go. So just take out your phone, and I want you to just swap your phone now with the person behind you or the person next to you. Just find someone to swap your phone with. You must make sure it's unlocked, okay? Great. The gentleman at the back, maybe you want to swap with that lady there. Great. Now, what I want you to do is I'm going to give you 20 seconds you can do whatever you want with that person's phone. I'm at a pulpit. I can give you these directions, right? Do whatever you want with that person's phone for the next 20 seconds. It's not a long period of time. Go. I see there's some nervous swappers out there, right? You've got 10 seconds. It's very quiet. 5 more seconds. Okay, now you need to give the phones back. You're all so respectful. This doesn't always happen, right? So I respect some people did not want to play this game, so they pretended they didn't have a phone. I really don't believe you. I think you did have a phone, right? That's okay. And then other of you swapped, but you didn't really do anything with the phone, right? You just looked at the other person. And then there was 1 or 2 of you that you actually went into that phone, and I don't know what you're doing. I'm not looking at you, don't worry. But you were looking at photos and maybe Facebook, or maybe you sent a message or tweeted something, and you had a really different relationship with that phone. But what I was sensing was it was a little bit uncomfortable, right? It was only 20 seconds, and that was your phone. And so this is what makes many of these ideas so remarkable when we're using technology, whether it's to go on a date or share our homes, often with complete strangers, based on very limited information. So let me tell you a story that really brings this to life. These 3 gentlemen here are the brilliant entrepreneurs that founded Airbnb, and their names are Brian, Joe, and Nate. And I first met them in 2008, so 9 years ago. And at the time, Airbnb isn't what it was today. It isn't what it is today, I should say. It was this site where people were renting out mattresses on their rooms. And so 2 things happened. I was actually writing my first book on the sharing economy, and I said to my editor, I found the opening story. This is the example of people taking their assets and creating value from them. And he said, no, I cannot let you open your book with this story because this company is going to be dead by the time the book goes to publication. Now, I was really glad that I sort of, stuck to my guns. But the funny thing is, if you read that bit, you'll see it's like they have 10,000 properties, which is nothing compared to today. The other person that I told was my husband. And I came home, and his name's Chris, and I said, I think I've just met the next eBay. And I think we should give them our money. And it was actually his money. I was still paying off my Harvard loans, I have to say, but he had some money. He was a corporate lawyer. And he said, well, so tell me what they do. And I said, first of all, let me tell you about these entrepreneurs, because I can tell you they're going to be successful because they're so curious about the world. They're so curious about human behavior, but they're also so resilient. And when you see those two things in a human being, they're often the DNA of a really great entrepreneur. So I went into this pitch, and I said, look, just bear with me, and you've got to keep in mind, I only had these photos, right? So I'm not really selling it very well, photos of mattresses on the floor. So this is the beginning, and their idea is that people like us and other people all around the world are going to open up their bedrooms and their bathrooms and all those rooms they usually keep hidden to guests, and they're going to take photographs, and they're going to post them on the internet, and then strangers from all around the world are going to book to stay in these rooms, and this is going to be the future of travel. And he looked at me like I'd lost the plot. You want to give these people and this idea your money. And so the first thing he said was, Rach, a lot can go wrong. But he said, this idea is never going to work because strangers won't trust one another. Strangers won't trust one another with their homes. And I said to him, Chris, I think you're wrong. Think of eBay. People buy secondhand cars on eBay without ever driving them. People trade with people with pseudonyms like Invisible Wizard, right? This is just the beginning. And he made a really good point. And his point was that eBay was about online transactions. So when you buy something on eBay, you don't meet that human being. And what I was talking about was using the internet to get off the internet and for people to meet up face to face. Now, he was right in some ways, because even 9 years ago, it was really hard to see how technology, particularly the smartphone and social networks, how it would change the way we could trust one another. And he was also really wrong. I mean, really wrong, right? Because for those of you who've gone on Airbnb, you'll see that it's not just the spare rooms and the holiday homes. If you want to make money, go build a tree house. That's what I recommend you do over the holidays. Tree houses are one of the most popular categories on Airbnb. You can stay in igloos. You can stay in aquariums. And Airbnb have just actually launched trips. So now what they've done for spaces, they're trying to do for experiences. And I learned the other day that one of the most popular trips is going to meet someone who rears wolves. So I joked with the founders, I was like, right, I just build a tree house and I go and get a pack of wolves and then I don't have to work again, because these people, they're making serious money. Some are making more than $150,000 a year through hosting these experiences. So what these guys have done is very smart. They've used technology to create a marketplace for assets that never had a marketplace before. And this graph really shows it. This graph really tells the story, right? So Airbnb, it was on top for quite a long time. Marriott didn't like it, so I think they made a few acquisitions. But Airbnb, remember that phone exercise, a company that is built on trust, strangers trusting one another, is now the second most valuable hospitality brand in the world. I like to show this graph to my husband as a reminder that he should always listen to me when it comes to future investing decisions. But the other thing that I found remarkable about those founders is that we had this conversation. You know how some conversations, they stick in your mind and you can't get rid of them, it's like they're just there. And I remember Joe Gebbia, and I said to him, oh, so you're building this marketplace. And I didn't get any further than that. And he said, we're not building a marketplace. He said, we're building a community. Because marketplaces are built on money. And most businesses are built on money. And money only goes so far. Because if you create a business that is built on money, that business becomes transactional. And so our business is going to be built on a different currency. If money is the currency of transactions, trust is the currency of interactions. And he's absolutely right. There's very few organizations and businesses in the world today that are actually built on the currency of trust. So what did these guys do? Why is Airbnb so significant in this story? Well, what Airbnb did was everyone who raised their hands had taken something that I call a trust leap. And trust leaps are really important for progress. They're really important for innovation, how we advance as a society. Because what they represent is when we take a risk as human beings to do something new or to do it differently from the way that we've always done it. So when human beings went from bartering to using money, that was a trust leap. The first time people got in an elevator, that was a trust leap. The first time you use eBay, the first time you put your credit card details into a website, the first time we all get into self-driving cars and let the car take over the wheel, that will be a trust leap. And what technology is doing is it is accelerating the pace at which we're leaping. So it's asking us to leap higher and faster than ever before, which is why as human beings we feel so much change, a constant state of change in our lives. Now, how does trust work? How do these trust leaps work? Well, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Airbnb or whether we're talking about self-driving cars, or even like placing your faith in someone that you've just met. Trust is a process. It's not a value. It's not something we can communicate. It's not a word. It's a process that happens between people or things, or as we're going to see, bots and algorithms. Now, whenever you're asking someone to trust, they are in this known state. And human beings, they love being in this known state. That's where we gravitate towards. And whenever you're asking someone to trust, there's something unknown, an unknown place, an unknown person, an unknown idea. And the line between these two things is what we call risk. So risk is the management of uncertainty that matters. Not all risks matter. There's some risks that matter. But risk isn't what pulls people. That force is trust. So the easiest way to think about trust is that it's a bridge between the known and the unknown. And that's why I define trust very simply as a confident relationship to the unknown. Now, this unknown piece is really important because sometimes people think, well, I trust this person because I know the outcome. If you know the outcome, if there is no risk, you don't need trust. You only need trust when there's actually uncertainty or a degree of risk. And so this explains how trust is actually this magical alchemy of being very vulnerable. There's a trust theorist called Morgan Deutsch, and he said it's this weird mixture of our fears and our hopes and our aspirations. So look at the flip side of this. So this is what trust is, a confident relationship with the unknown. And I think this is really important to keep in mind for when you look at the flip side of this, for when trust breaks down. Now, the great thing about being someone who researches trust is that I have a lot of new material. Every single week, someone or something or some company in the world breaches our trust. So Equifax, the Paradise Papers, the News Corp phone hacking, the Volkswagen emissions scandal. And what's really interesting is when you look at these scandals, abuse in the Catholic Church, you see a same pattern in the breakdown of trust. And one of the root causes of this, I think, is lack of accountability. So this feeling that people can do terrible things. You know, the CEO of Volkswagen, when he knew about Dieselgate, and when he left, he got a multi-million-dollar payout. What does that signal to that organization? That you can behave like this and it's actually okay. And one of the things that is so dangerous to trust is when leaders and organizations, they know about something and they keep it hidden. So if you think about the Equifax data breach, they knew about that for 6 weeks before they told anyone. Executives sold their shares when they found out about it, and they are still there. So one of the things that's been interesting to me is watching not just the breach of trust, but how companies respond. And it's a little painful, right? Because every time you see them get it wrong. And it's actually not that hard to respond to a trust breach and actually to rebuild trust. And think of that line between those two things. You've literally got to fill the petrol tank again. And I think there's a 4-step process. So the first is responsiveness. What do I mean by responsiveness? It's literally related to time, right? So the mistake organizations make is they think they have a long time to respond, and that time is often compressed. The second is ownership. So if you read the description of what went wrong, organizations that often point the finger at some low-level employee, and they'll say it was an individual act. It wasn't an individual act. That's either systemic in the culture or that's some kind of breakdown. So owning the problem and not blaming it on some individual, but actually saying as an organization we own this problem is the next step. The third is empathy. And what I mean by empathy is actually addressing the human consequence for the breach of trust. So not talking about the gigabytes of data that were lost, but what does this mean for human lives? And then this fourth step is what we talked about, which is accountability. And accountability is so important because in order to trust again, you have to believe that system has changed, right? You have to have confidence in the system. So after the financial crisis, I don't know about you, but when only one banker went to jail, I didn't really feel like the financial system had been reformed. So these are the things we need to do when trust breaks down. All right, let's move on and let's look at technology, trust in technology companies and platforms. And I'm talking about everything here from things like Uber to things like Facebook. Now, what's really interesting, and I know this is topical at the moment, is another really big driver as to why trust is breaking down is, in fact, misinformation. So the World Economic Forum actually said that misinformation, not just fake news, because there's a distinction, but misinformation is one of the top 10 threats to society. Now, why is it such a threat to society? Well, because what happens is we can go online and we can find information that verifies our fears. And when we find information that verifies our fears, it amplifies our anger. And then this cycle of distrust is magnified. Now, why is that so dangerous? Because certain people, like Trump, they know how to manipulate this cycle. So that's why he's always talking about distrusting the media, because what it does is it creates a vacuum. And it creates a vacuum for conspiracy theories. It creates a vacuum for people who are very smart in talking to feelings over facts. And we may not like it, but he actually represents a form of transparency to many people. He is a voice against things that they didn't believe in, a lack of faith in the establishment and the system. So the worrying thing about misinformation and fake news is that it's very hard to detect. So all these three pieces of content were pieces of content that appeared at the top of my Facebook feed. And I had the same reaction, so I kind of knew the one in the middle about the Pope endorsing Trump was fake. I wasn't so sure about the Ebola crisis now breaking out in Atlanta, but I thought the Boston Globe was real. I thought that after the immigration ban that deportations had begun. And this is a real issue, because what I realized when I thought about it, I was very angry at Facebook and blah, 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 but I realized that I had a responsibility in this, because without even thinking about it, I had outsourced my capacity to trust to an algorithm. And so when two-thirds of Americans are using Facebook as their source of news, they have outsourced their capacity to trust to an algorithm. And what's interesting to me is that we're very quick to blame the platforms. But the platforms are only a mirror of all our behaviors, of what the community does. And what I've seen is when we don't like what we see, we blame the mirror. Now, I'm not saying these tech companies, I'm very hard on them. I think they have to be more accountable. And what's really interesting about Facebook is if you look at the volume, it's the scale of the problem that's so huge. So we post more than 4,000 photos every second, 1.3 million posts every single minute. Do you know how many community moderators they have? They now have, it was 4,500 when I made this slide a few weeks ago. They have 7,500 moderators. That means there's one moderator per 466,000 users. So I think what's happening with Facebook is a bigger trend, and that we're starting to say these tech companies are the new institutions of the world. And if they're the new institutions of the world, they have to be more accountable. You know, Facebook can't say it's a pathway that just connects users. It is the media company now in the world. And so we need these platforms to take more responsibility for giving us the tools to reduce the risk of bad things happening, but also to take responsibility when things go wrong. But as I said, we also play a role in this. You know, if we want independent journalism, we should go to the NewYorkTimes.com or WashingtonPost.com. We shouldn't get our news from Facebook. And what this requires is actually very simple. Technology is accelerating trust. We're living in this age of trust on speed. So we click and we swipe and we accept and we share without thinking about whether this thing or this piece of content is worthy of our trust. And so one of the things I think we need to be doing as individuals is taking a trust pause, thinking twice before we share that piece of content or place our faith in a complete stranger. Okay, just to wrap, I now want to talk about trust in other people. And as I said, the people, it can be a real human being or it could be a cyber bot or Sophia the robot. Now, the good thing is that while trust is quite an abstract thing, an ethereal thing, when we say we need more trust in society, we're actually talking about the wrong thing. We don't want more trust in people like Bernie Madoff, right? What we want is more trustworthy people. What we want is more trustworthy systems. And there's a real science behind what makes something or someone trustworthy. And it really comes down to 4 things. The first is competence. Do you have the skills, the knowledge, the information to do what you say you're going to do? The second is reliability. And this is really about time and being dependable. This is the how you do things. How you do things. And then on the right-hand side is the second part of the formula, which is the why you do things. And this is made up of benevolence, so how much do you care? And what I think is the most important ingredient, which is integrity. And integrity isn't necessarily about being a good or charitable human being. It's about stating your intentions, about stating your motives, and agreeing that your intentions align with mine. So if you think about trust that you've placed in someone where trust is broken down, it's often because there's a misalignment of intentions. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is contextual, right? So it's kind of like a barometer. You need different amounts of different ingredients for different situations. But this is really hard to get right. To go back to Doris the dodgy nanny, right? She was competent and she was reliable. You could even argue that she cared. But her intentions were definitely not aligned with my parents. So if this is so hard to get right in human beings, how are we going to cope when we have to make decisions, make assessments around robots and algorithms that we can't see? So let me finish by sharing a personal story with you. No prizes for guessing who this little lobster is. It's my daughter, Grace, and she's 3.5 years old, and she's a real character, feisty character. And there's something you should know about her is that she really loves clothes. And her decision around what she wears in the morning is very important to her. No one can interfere with this process, and it takes a long time. And so you can see this is an outfit that she's chosen to play in the garden, because you need to wear 2 tiaras when you play in the garden. Now, the reason why I tell you this is I tried this experiment with her, where I introduced her to Alexa, who has an Amazon Echo. This lady here. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Alexa is the Amazon Echo. It's like a very helpful female assistant. So I said to her, Gracie, I put it on the thing, I want you to meet Alexa. You can now do whatever you want with her. So she looked at me and she goes, Mummy, is she like Siri? And I thought, this is amazing. Like, she's 3.5, she can't read, she can't ride a bike, but she understands in her capacity that here is another virtual assistant that's going to help her. So first of all, and she's half Australian, half British, and so I think it was the Brit in her that was coming out. The first thing she says is, will it rain today? And then she asks her a lot of questions about the weather. And this is something very common that we do. We test the technology with something that's very familiar to us. And then she asked, I heard the soundtrack from Frozen, that movie, over and over again, and then sing over and over again. And that was really day 1. Day 2, she figured out she could order things. Now think of it, she's 3.5 years old. Like most of her day, you're saying, no, don't touch this, don't do that. And she realizes with her voice, she can order things. Now, thankfully, she loves blueberries. So she ordered a really big box of blueberries, and she couldn't believe it when they arrived at the next day. It was like magic to her. And I thought, I won't point out at this point that it's not magic, it's actually this company called Amazon with very strong commercial intentions that is making this magical technology work. But it was on day 3 that something very significant happened. She came downstairs, and she usually says, "Good morning, Mom. Good morning, Jack. Good morning, Dad." The first thing she says hello to, "Good morning, Alexa. What should I do today?" And then she said, "What should I wear?" And I couldn't believe this, because I spent 3.5 years fighting these fashion choices, and in 3 days, she's letting Alexa decide what she should wear. Now, what she didn't realize is that in this next generation of Alexa, there's a camera. So Alexa doesn't just hear you, she sees you. And because Amazon have just launched a new fashion brand, they're going to try and do to fashion what they've done to books. You could stand in front of Alexa, and with their style check algorithm, it would give you a rating. So it would rate the leopard print tiara outfit, something or other, and then the winner is the weird furry hat thing with the giraffe, whatever that thing is. But what it also does is it makes suggestions. So it would look at her and say, "You know what, those trainers are a bit shabby." We wouldn't say it like that, but it said, "Would you like a new pair of trainers? And maybe you'd like them ordered and sent to your school or to your home." Now, the reason why this story is so significant is that we've gone through this shift with technology, that our relationship to technology, our trust in technology, whether it's the washing machine or the ATM or this slide clicker, is that it does something for us. It's very much on that house side of the equation, that it's competent and that it's reliable. But with Gracie, and with not just kids, with us as well, technology is now not just doing things for us, it's deciding things for us. And when we trust technology to make decisions, we have to trust the why side of the equation. We have to understand the intentions of these algorithms. So, just to wrap up, I don't want to end on a bad note, because there's this very dark mood about technology. And I want to go back to the question I asked you at the beginning, which was, can technology make us smarter about who we trust? And I think it can when it's used in the right way. So I started to research babysitting platforms. And these are really incredible when you think about it, because renting out your home sounds risky, but finding a complete stranger to look after your kids, now that is a crazy idea. And so, speaking to the founders, I found out something amazing, is that they're using machine learning to basically, when someone says, "Yes, I have a clean driving record," or "Yes, I have a childcare diploma," or "Yes, I have 10 references and I'm great with kids," or "I love children, but yet they hate children online," or they're showing inappropriate pictures, 75% of all people who apply to be a caregiver on Urban Sitter are rejected. And so I said to Lynn, the founder, would Doris have made it onto the platform? And she said, no, Doris would never have made the cut, because your parents would have known that she didn't belong to the Salvation Army, that she did have a criminal record, and that her references were fake. And so this, I think, is the challenge that we face in society, is that we have to find the right balance between technology and humanness. We, the humans, need to stay in control of the technology versus letting it control us. And really, the way that we do that is we make sure the technology amplifies what it means to be human, that it amplifies our emotional intelligence versus taking over that decision-making. So I think, at the end of the day, the decision on who we trust is a human decision. And each and every one of us can play a role in this. We can all slow down and ask ourselves, is this person, or this thing, or this piece of information, is it worthy of our trust? And every time we engage in that process, even if it feels small to us, we are, in our own way, taking care of what I think is society's most precious and fragile asset, which is trust. Thank you very much.
Okay, as someone that just got into an Uber car this morning, not just with the car driver I didn't know, but sharing it with some other person who was stranded outside the train station, I didn't think at all about the people giving me the ride or the person accompanying me on the ride. I just thought about the service.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions on that topic. One is, do you think we are bypassing what we're trusting? I was not thinking about individuals and their criminal records. I was simply thinking, will this show up and get me to work?
So it's a really good question. So I think what happens, and this isn't a criticism because I do it too, is that we let convenience trump trust. So what we do is we sign up for these things, or we automatically use these things because we want the benefit. So we're not even conscious of who we're trusting. And Uber's a really interesting example because, traditionally, if you bought something from CVS, right, there'll be trust in the product and there'll be trust in CVS, the pharmacy, right? But your trust isn't really in Uber, the company. And it's not really in the driver, it's in the platform. And so this, I think, is part of the beauty of what technology is doing, but it's part of the danger because it means that you just give your trust away really easily and often let the benefit trump the decision of whether this is really an ethical company or whether this is really safe or whatever it is. And we see this in all different areas of our lives.
Which brings me to the second issue, which is really much more contentious for me, which is some of the security checks obviously don't work because we've ended up with the Uber driver the day after being a 5-star rated driver in New York driving into the crowd and killing a group of people. So how good are these security checks? And then the much worse worry for me is you yourself wrote in that article in The Guardian about the deep security checks on the web. I'm not sure I want to be part of that. And it even made you nervous when the guy was doing checks on you.
Yeah, but the problem is we can't have both. So we can't say, people get through the net and then be worried about more deeper assessments on whether someone is trustworthy. And I think the thing to remind us is that current sort of gold standards of trust, so criminal background checks, credit card checks, credit score checks, they are so flawed. And so one of the problems is that we don't have the right mechanisms to keep people safe. And so what the regulators say is we need more background checks. Background checks aren't going to keep people who could be unsafe on Uber. For example, there was a driver that killed 6 people and owned 16 guns because a background check isn't going to pick that up. So what companies that I wrote about called Truly are doing is they're not trying to get people like you and I think this is what we worry about. They're trying to get truly bad actors. So for example, on Airbnb, they're deep trawling the web to look at those behaviors. So for example, like people hosting big sex orgies on Airbnb is actually a problem. That behavior is really easy to detect online because they can look at what these people are posting on social media. They can look at how they're advertising these events. So what they're looking at is how this deep trawling, it's not to catch people who don't even have a digital footprint or who are good actors, it's the really bad actors that can destroy these platforms. But it is creepy. It is very weird when you know that someone is looking at your entire life history, and from an email and from my name, they could even pick up stuff on my maiden name. And it was I think 8,000 hits came up within 30 seconds.
So my last question.
I was number 1 trust score, so I was very proud of that.
My last question before we open it up is, this very point is a pivotal one that you ended on, about keeping the humanness. It's almost like you've demonstrated with your daughter that it's already impossible to do that. I mean, they're trying right now to ethically program robots, but if you asked me, did I want a robot to give me end-of-life care, I'd probably say no. But I know a lot of people would sign up for that. So I think with your daughter Gracie, now she's discovered that this friend can order things, unlimited supplies on Amazon and who knows what. How do you shut that down? Did you take it away from her? Or?
I actually did unplug the thing, but you can't. I mean, I think this is it sounds such a big thing, but how you teach children what it means to be human. And at the moment, I can touch you and we can make that distinction, but within 10 years, avatars and augmented reality will be so good that I wouldn't know if you were real. And so, some of the very sad stories that you hear about is when people even fall in love with cyberbots because they think, to your point with the elderly home, they think they're better than a real boyfriend because they're always there and they get more intelligent and more empathetic over time. And what I've seen with my kids is, so one is 6, the other one is 3.5, there's a very small window to teach them. So my son, it's almost too late because he's at school now and they have bring your own device. And so I think one of the things is really teaching them what an addiction is, how to turn it off, and what is behind the machine. And there are ways to do that. So, I mean, it's this morning I had breakfast with Sherry Turkle, who's at MIT, and she wrote this amazing book. She's been talking about this for 20 years. And she said to me, I'm so depressed because I've just found out that Times Person of the Year is going to be a robot. And not just any robot, but this kid's toy that's going to be the best-selling toy at Christmas. And she's like, how can we call this the Person of the Year? And that we're celebrating what these robots can do. And she did an amazing thing where she actually intervened with Mattel. And Mattel were going to bring out Aristotle, which is the children's equivalent of Alexa. And she got them to get rid of this product because the way kids and parents were seeing it, you could just outsource your parenting. So Aristotle would learn what songs and what sounds that your baby needed to go back to sleep. Now, I know as a sleep-deprived, I'd turn Aristotle on, right? But like those moments, those hard moments are actually what makes those relationships. So it is very worrying.
I'm Jerome Marion, and I think, Rachel, that everyone in this room will agree with at least 2 points. The first is that you've identified a very significant phenomenon, and you've addressed it beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
Given that accomplishment, the second thing I think everyone in this room would like to hear more about from you immediately would be how we apply your research and your findings very specifically in the field of politics. I've got a vested interest because I'm researching a book, Politics as a Vocation in Postmodernity, and the question of how we redefine politics so it is once again a noble profession. You and I and everyone else in this room doubtless knows enough to go to the New York Times or the Washington Post, as you said, when we want to check a breaking news story. We don't go to InfoWars or Breitbart, but a significant number of Americans do. How do we change that so that we can therefore change our politics? Thank you.
I think it's a great question, and I don't think I have a sufficient answer. I really don't. But I do think it starts at a young age. I really do. I think a lot of this is around education and the way not just politics is taught, but Stanford recently did a study where they looked at educated children and their ability to actually discern information. And I teach at Oxford, and some of my graduate students, they cite Wikipedia. And so I think information, how you find the truth, how you fact-check things, this is really important. And we saw this in Brexit. It's not just happening here, that my dad is an intelligent man, and he voted to leave Brexit because he believed what they were saying, that they were going to save the NHS £375 million a week. And so I don't have an answer, but I think a lot of it actually comes in making sure people have the right information. And then I think what's also happening is people, this is my view, that we feel very disenchanted with political systems because it feels like politics serves the system, not citizens. So how you change that so that we actually start serving people's needs versus the beasts of the system. And I think this is particularly acute in the United States is the problem. That people, it's not that they've lost their faith in politics, they've lost their faith in the political system. How we restore that, I do not know, but I will give it more thought. I am giving it more thought. So.
Hi there. So I think this is a wonderful topic, and you mentioned one shift, which is that people are moving from a society in which you trust institutions primarily, and to a society where people can often trust complete strangers. But I think there's a second shift, which is, it ties to what you said, which is that people have more information than they've ever had before in order to gauge trust. I mean, you talked about these companies that do a deep search on the web to come up with any scrap of information that could have happened decades ago about a person. And this is a tough question, but I think everyone's grappling with it, which is how do you maintain this balance between people being accountable for what they do and the safety of people, and giving people a chance to reinvent themselves and to and it's crazy. I remember going to the UK and searching my name on Google, which I do sometimes, just to see, and there was nothing that came up because they have, well, almost nothing, because they have laws where you're allowed to be forgotten. How do you feel about that?
No, I mean, it's something I talk extensively about in the book, because you should have the right to be young and foolish, and you should have the right to delete transgressions. I think that's very different from being accountable and being a good citizen. You should have the right to delete. And so I'm encouraged by not just all the ruling that happened around the right to be forgotten, which was about 2-3 years ago now, but you may have been following what's happening with GDPR. Have you seen this? It's the General Data Protection Regulation. And it's coming out of the European Union. And it's going to be huge. I mean, companies are worried because it gives us not complete control, but we have the right to ask companies now what data they have on us. So this one woman wrote to Tinder, and she thought she'd get maybe 5 pages back. She got 800 pages back. And then she realized, like, they weren't just tracking who she was looking at on Tinder, they were tracking all her locations. They knew where she'd been on dates. She knew how long that she spent on that date. So the ability to actually see what data companies have on us, the right to delete that data, and also the right to demand that that data isn't sold on. And so I do think in this instance, I'm not always an advocate of regulation, but we do need stronger regulation that takes control away from the companies and puts it back in the hands of users and consumers and makes it more visible around what these companies are doing. Because that's the thing that frightens me, is it's not apathy, it's ignorance, because it's kept hidden from us. So I 100% agree with you.
I guess my question now you've addressed a lot of it. The thing I personally think a lot about, and I think it's something that we all have to ask ourselves, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it, is about how do we take advantage of these big data-driven solutions while also maintaining enough privacy? And you're mentioning all this ability to kind of ask these companies to delete your data. But in some way, there is the issue of them collecting it in the first place. And I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that balance between trust and privacy and how we can sort of better maintain that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds very simple. It's very complicated to actually execute, but this should all be permission-based. And so, you know, the company I was talking about was called Truly. There's others out there called Trady and Verify, and you have to opt into this. And this is one of the things that I want to see is so many systems are designed for us to opt out. And I don't know about you, but do you ever read the terms and conditions? Right? Like that. I mean, first of all, I had to wear very strong lenses, and you need like a magnifying glass, and it's trying to get you to speed through that process. And so I think companies, you should be much more aware of what you're signing up to and when you're giving your permission over. Around your question around trust and privacy, of course, these two things are really tied together. I think, though, what we have to be careful is that we're asking for more transparency. It's actually a very low goal. So if you go back to my definition of what trust is, a confident relationship to the unknown, we've as a society given up on trust if we need things to be transparent. And so I think we need more privacy and we need more control, but we don't necessarily need more transparency. That shouldn't be the end objective here.
Oh, to my question. Tim Berners-Lee actually is on, who actually did have something to do with the creation of the internet, I guess.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, talks about this very thing about, you know, what Ralph Nader calls contracts of adhesion. I mean, whoever reads that stuff, it's ridiculous. So thank you for that. But it suddenly occurred to me to ask you about internet neutrality. Just the other day, there was a vote at the now Republican-dominated FCC in Washington to loosen up ownership restrictions on media, which has gotten some attention from people concerned about this. But in that context, people have now been alerted to a vote apparently has been scheduled for, I believe, December 8th by the FCC on internet neutrality. Could you say a little about your understanding of this issue, and do you agree that it's important and people maybe should pay some attention and we should try our best not to let that happen?
Yeah, no, and I think it's a great question. And I think part of the problem is the language that people are using around it. I mean, even net neutrality, and if you look at the regulation, and I think more people would wake up and realize how important this is if we talked about monopolies. And this isn't the same as monopolies we've had. These are network monopolies. So once you're locked in, that monopoly is only going to scale and get bigger and bigger, and it's very hard for people to leave. And so I think one of the biggest mistakes we've made with the internet is the scale of these companies. That Amazon should not have the control, I'm saying this as an author, over book distribution. They shouldn't, I don't know how Whole Foods sold to them. I know from a commercial perspective, and now they're going to do it to fashion, and it's too much power in the world. And as soon as a society, you let a company or a platform take control around the way value is distributed or the way information flows, and so it comes from one dominant source, and then they control the pipes, and they control how that reaches another person. That is a very precarious place for a society to be. And so I think you're absolutely right, is what they're talking about is very dangerous because it will just give more control for this concentration of information versus what I think we need to do is actually to break down the scale and the hold of these enormous companies.
Thank you. It seems like you kind of addressed it, but my question is basically looking at these new technologies and the extent, the just ubiquity of them, where is the regulation lie? I mean, you mentioned that there are, I guess, EU regulations that are coming down.
Yeah.
But it seems as though in every region, in every corner of the world, there's, all of that is kind of, widely distributed.
Yeah.
And so to have kind of concrete global understandings, or you could say guidelines, or you could say regulations around this seems to be like, kind of, I mean, is it almost like whack-a-mole as
It
far
is like
as,
whack-a-mole, yeah.
how you create consensus?
Yeah, it's a very insightful question. And if you talk to the guys that run regulation or policy or Airbnb, they talk about the same thing, is they're not even talking about countries or states. They often have to go city by city because there's different compliance laws. The thing I feel really strongly about is that we need a different DNA to regulation. We need a different type of regulator because the regulator, and I get to interact with many of them, they're great, very smart people. But you remember that I showed at the beginning, the triangle? That's how they think about regulation generally, that it's top-down, that it's hierarchical, that it's about more compliance and more governance, and that just doesn't work when you're dealing with networks and systems. So I think we have to, the idea shouldn't be to put the institution at the middle of the network. What we should be looking at is how we redesign a new kind of social safety net. And we're seeing this starting to emerge. Like one of the big issues is about the future of work. We see this with the Uber drivers, right? Are they independent contractors or are they employees? And so what I think we need is this new social safety net where if things go wrong, thinking about both sides of the market, not just the consumer, but the provider as well, how we offer these new kinds of protections. And I don't think that is through traditional compliance-driven regulation.
Well, that was a very stimulating discussion about the implications of the future and if trust does exist and if it's got a new definition even in
Or
the new
flavor,
technological world. Yeah. So thank you, Rachel, very much for coming and the last pit stop for you. And